May 8th, 1945, the day Germany surrendered, but not the day peace arrived. In the industrial heart of the Ruhr, smoke still hung low over the ruins. Cellars were filled with the smell of fear and mold. Bomb craters had become playgrounds for rats, and in the faint light of dawn, a German mother named Margaret Bauer, 31 years old, held her son against her chest in the corner of a cold, underground shelter. She could hear the distant roar of engines, American jeeps, rolling closer through what used to be her street in Essen. Her husband had died in Normandy the year before. Now she believed she was about to pay for his uniform. When the door to the cellar opened, she covered her child's face, whispering, "Don't look." The soldiers stepped inside, boots scraping broken glass. For one unbearable second, she thought the war had followed her underground. Then something impossible happened. One of them, a young GI from Ohio named Private Leonard Brooks, reached into his pack, pulled out a bottle of milk, and placed it gently on the dusty floor. For the kid, he said, not as a conqueror, but as someone who had seen too many children cry. She didn't say a word. Her lips trembled, then broke into tears that came from somewhere deeper than fear, from exhaustion, from disbelief, from the strange realization that Mercy had walked into the cellar wearing an American uniform. The soldier nodded once and left. In the silence that followed, only the soft clinking of the milk bottle against the stone floor echoed like a heartbeat. The streets above were a wasteland. Over 3.6 million German homes lay destroyed across the Reich. In cities like Essen and Cologne, women made up nearly 70% of the surviving civilian population, most of them widows or wives of missing soldiers. Food supply lines had collapsed. Ration cards meant little when there was nothing left to ration. By June, an estimated 20 million Germans faced acute malnutrition, and in some areas, civilians survived on fewer than 900 calories per day, half the amount needed to sustain basic health. The Americans called this landscape a gray victory. The war was over, but revenge was easy, and compassion was complicated. Soldiers were haunted by the faces of their dead friends, yet here they were, ordered to protect the people who had once cheered for Hitler. Brooks wrote in a letter home to his sister, "They told us we'd see the enemy. What I saw were women who looked like my mother, just thinner. In those first weeks, the lines blurred, uniforms against rags, victors against survivors. Every act of kindness risked misunderstanding, yet every refusal of it risked something worse, becoming the very thing they had fought." The woman and her child never learned the soldier's name, but for months after, she kept the empty milk bottle on a shelf above the rubble stove, its glass clouded by soot and hope. To her, it was proof that the world had not gone entirely mad, that even in defeat, a gesture of humanity could feel like victory. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. In the aftermath of surrender, the Allied armies moved from conquerors to reluctant caretakers. Orders came not from emotion, but from command headquarters. Yet those words would test the moral endurance of men who had seen too much death. On May 10th, 1945, a directive circulated through the offices of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF. Signed under General Dwight D. Eisenhower, it was known as Directive Number 1067. Its language was stark. Germany was not to be rebuilt. It was to be prevented from ever waging war again. But hidden beneath its punitive tone, Eisenhower himself added a personal order to his officers. You will not take revenge. You will represent civilization. For soldiers fresh from battlefields like Bastogne and the Ardennes, that command felt impossible. Sergeant William Hanley, who had lost 3 men to a sniper near Aachen, wrote in his notebook that night, "They tell us to be better than what we fought. Hardest order I've ever heard." In camps around the Rhine, where over 5 million German prisoners sat behind barbed wire, resentment still simmered. American guards saw the swastika tattooed on wrists, the iron crosses pinned to torn coats. They remembered the burned villages of France, the mass graves of Poland. Yet they were told to keep discipline, not through hate, but through restraint, a new kind of battlefield. Eisenhower's message spread quietly through every chain of command. Officers repeated it at dawn roll calls. No revenge, no humiliation, you represent America. The phrase order of restraint began as a whisper, but it shaped an entire occupation. Soldiers who wanted to vent their rage found themselves stopped by their own commanders. Some protested, some broke down. A corporal from Kansas reportedly threw his helmet into the Rhine, shouting, "You can't tell me not to hate them." But another, a medic from Chicago, picked it up and said, "Maybe that's exactly what we fought for." Within weeks, rations that were once reserved for GIs were diverted to civilians. The U.S. Army shipped over 2,000 tons of food into the ruined western zones, feeding children who had been taught that Americans were monsters. Hanley was assigned to oversee one of the first distribution depots near Koblenz. Every day, lines of hollow-faced women waited in silence as soldiers unloaded crates stamped with the white star. "It felt like giving bread to ghosts," he later wrote. There were moments of collapse, too. A GI slapping a German who spat on the flag. An officer who quietly looked away when hungry mothers snuck into supply tents. Yet, gradually, something fragile began to change. Soldiers who once avoided eye contact started saying, "Guten Morgen." Children began waving at convoys instead of hiding from them. The transformation was not born from speeches or policy, but from exhaustion, from the shared realization that vengeance would only prolong the war in another form. The order of restraint never appeared in any textbook of military science, but it redefined victory. It taught men that the true end of war comes not with the silence of guns, but with the decision not to fire them again. In his final report that summer, General Clay wrote a single line that summed up the weight of those months. "We are here to punish tyranny, not to inherit it." Cologne, July 1945. The cathedral still stood, though its windows were gone, and its spires scorched black by 1,000 nights of bombing. Around it lay a landscape that no one had prepared for. Not rubble, but silence. And in that silence, an American field kitchen began to operate where the pews once stood. Soldiers dragged in iron stoves and fuel drums, rolling them past shattered statues of saints. They named the place the Chapel Kitchen. Every morning, before the sun cut through the dust clouds, Sergeant Thomas Greer and his men from the 97th Infantry set up their pots under the cracked arches. They served barley soup to anyone who arrived, women in threadbare coats, children barefoot in the ash, old men with medals pinned to their hunger. "We cook for whoever can still walk," Greer wrote to his wife in Ohio. "The first thing they ask isn't why, it's how much." By August, the chapel was feeding up to around 200 civilians a day. The soldiers joked that they had become priests of potatoes, yet each ladle of soup became something more than charity. It was a fragile truce between people who only months earlier had been mortal enemies. One of the volunteers, Private Sam Levine, a Jewish cook from New York whose family had fled Germany in 1933, stirred the broth in silence. When a German priest approached him one afternoon, the air froze. The old man said quietly, "They turned my altar into a table for the hungry. I think God approves." Levine nodded, eyes wet, and went back to stirring. Inside that ruined church, the hierarchy of war dissolved. Helmets sat next to shawls. Soldiers shared cigarettes with boys who had never seen chocolate before. A corporal played harmonica during the line, and for a few seconds, laughter returned to a city that had forgotten the sound. Outside, trucks from the U.S. Quartermaster Corps unloaded sacks marked U.S. Army, Humanitarian Relief. Between June and September 1945, over 83,000 tons of food were distributed to German civilians across the U.S. occupation zone, more calories than many Americans knew were being given to their former enemies. But the Chapel Kitchen was more than a statistic. It was a moral experiment. Could mercy survive amid ruins? The soldiers there began keeping a small ledger, not of supplies, but of faces. "Girl with blue ribbon, 6 years old, smiled today," one line read. "Old man with violin, asked to play tomorrow." These tiny notes, found decades later in an archive in Koblenz, tell the story no history book captured, that the rebuilding of Germany began not with cement, but with soup. One evening, as the candles flickered against the broken stained glass, Greer told his men, "We're cooking history, boys. Every spoon we serve is one less bullet the next war will need." Outside, the cathedral bells, long silent, were struck once by hand, a hollow sound that rolled through the empty streets. For a moment, even the ruins seemed to breathe. Autumn 1945, The air over Bavaria carried the mixed scent of coal smoke and survival. Markets were opening again, though the stalls were mostly empty. In the small town of Würzburg, a crowd had gathered in front of a woman with a red scarf tied around her neck. Her name was Anna Keller, 35, once a baker's wife, now a symbol of shame. She had been accused of fraternizing with the occupiers. In her case, she had cooked for American soldiers when they first arrived, exchanging bread for flour and safety for gossip. Now the war was over, and her neighbors wanted revenge of their own. They shouted, "Ami hooray!" and threw stones. The same people who once begged for food now hurled rage to hide their fear. Anna covered her head, trembling, and thought of her little boy hiding at home. In that moment, a jeep turned the corner, brakes screeching. The man who stepped out was Lieutenant Robert Hayes, one of the GIs she had fed months earlier when he was posted outside town. He still carried the scar of a bullet from the last firefight near Nuremberg. He saw the mob, saw the woman on her knees, and without a word, walked between her and the stones. "Enough," he said, raising his hand. The crowd froze. No weapon, no threat, just the authority of someone who had looked death in the face too long to tolerate cruelty. A young man shouted, "She's a traitor!" Hayes looked at him and answered, "So is anyone who forgot what mercy looks like." Silence fell. Then slowly the mob drifted away, embarrassed, leaving only dust and the sound of Anna's sobs. That night, she sat on her doorstep, the red scarf folded in her lap. It had once been a mark of shame, the color of betrayal. Now, after Hayes returned it to her, saying, "Keep it, it suits courage better than guilt," it became something else entirely. Later photographs from Würzburg show her wearing it again, not hiding anymore, baking bread for children in the American Relief Line. The scarf appeared in local folklore, a woman in red who baked for both sides, a story mothers whispered to remind their children that kindness could outlast war. By the end of 1945, over 300 German women had been attacked publicly for similar collaborations across the American zone. Yet in towns like Würzburg, where U.S. patrols intervened, violence quickly declined. Hayes filed a report titled "Civil Unrest Prevention, Female Targets," noting, "Fear turns inward when no enemy remains." Behind every statistic was a story like Anna's, complex, human, contradictory. These women had lived in a vacuum of authority, surviving by instincts older than politics. Their redemption came not from courts, but from simple acts of recognition. A soldier shielding them, a neighbor sharing bread again, a child daring to wave at a passing jeep. One American chaplain, witnessing a similar scene, wrote home, "We came here to punish. We are learning to protect." And so the red scarf remained, bright against the gray rubble. A color once cursed, turned into a banner of survival. Berlin, winter of 1946. Snow drifted through the broken windows of what had once been a cafe near Alexanderplatz. The city was a skeleton of stone and silence. Children searched for coal among the ruins, women queued for hours for a crust of bread, and the Americans patrolled streets where no one smiled. It was here, in a corner of the Tiergarten district, that a patrol truck stopped one morning. A small girl stood by the roadside clutching a single loaf of bread. Her name was Greta Hoffman, age 8. Private James Jimmy Wallace, a GI from Detroit, remembered her from the previous day when his unit had distributed loaves near the temporary soup station. She had stood so still that the other children pushed ahead of her, yet she waited until the end and took only one. Now, more than 24 hours later, she was in the same spot, the loaf still whole, her tiny hands red from cold. Wallace approached and asked in slow German, "Why don't you eat?" Greta hesitated, then whispered, "Ich will teilen." I want to share. That single sentence struck the men harder than any bullet. They had entered Berlin prepared to guard warehouses, not their own hearts. Wallace wrote in his pocket notebook, "A child of the enemy waited all night to give back half a loaf we gave her. How do you win a war against that?" He reported the story to his captain, who later sent the girl's name to the local relief office. Within a week, Greta and her mother were given a ration card and a place in a women's dormitory rebuilt by the U.S. Army engineers. But the story traveled far beyond her street. Soldiers began calling her the little Berlin girl who guarded a loaf. It reached newspapers back home, printed beneath headlines about the American Food Relief Program, which by March 1946 was feeding over 4 3 million Germans daily. That one child's instinct to share became a mirror of what was happening on a national scale. Compassion spreading through fatigue. American soldiers who had seen unspeakable horror were now rebuilding bakeries and installing stoves in the same cities they had bombed. Psychologists in the occupation forces noted a strange transformation. The enemy was disappearing, replaced by people. One evening, Wallace and his fellow soldiers returned to the Tiergarten checkpoint to find children waiting. Greta was among them, waving shyly. She held a smaller piece of bread this time, wrapped in paper. "For you," she said. He took it, unable to reply. That night, he wrote to his mother, "Her loaf outlasted my hate." The following year, the same spot became part of a relief station distributing care packages, an American initiative that sent over 100 million parcels worldwide, many to former Axis civilians. In later photographs, the same children who once scavenged rubble were smiling beside soldiers, holding canned milk and biscuits. Tell me honestly, if you had been in their place, hungry, humiliated, surrounded by ruins, would you still have chosen to share like that little girl did? Spring 1946. The snow had melted, and with it, something darker inside many soldiers. In the American zone, the war's ghosts still followed every man, not in gunfire, but in the quiet moments between patrols. Sergeant Harold Jenkins, 32, from Kentucky, had fought through Normandy and the Ardennes. He carried the memory of his best friend, killed by a German mortar near Bastogne. And yet, here he was, supervising a food depot in Kassel, handing out flour to the very people he once swore he would never forgive. One afternoon, his superior officer stormed into the depot. "You're giving out double rations again," the major snapped. Jenkins stood his ground. "They've got children out there with ribs you can count from 20 feet. The major's voice hardened. "You're being too kind, Sergeant. You're forgetting what they did." Jenkins replied quietly, "If we don't feed the enemy's children, we'll have to fight them again." That line became legend within the unit, not because it sounded noble, but because it silenced everyone who heard it. It was repeated in barracks, mess halls, even in Washington reports as a footnote to post-war discipline reviews. Years later, historians would quote it in policy analyses of the occupation's moral turn. But at that moment, it was simply one man's refusal to hate. The code of kindness, as soldiers began calling it informally, spread through stories like that. Men started writing letters home about German kids who reminded them of their own. Some officers began informal exchange tables, soldiers giving small gifts or rations to families who helped clean or repair barracks. It wasn't regulation, but it was tolerated. Eisenhower's military governor, General Lucius D. Clay, noted in a June 1946 memo that morale is highest in units that maintain human contact with civilians. What had begun as discipline had evolved into empathy. Jenkins kept a diary. One entry, dated April 4th, 1946, read, "A boy about 9 came to the gate asking for a potato peel. I gave him 2. He said thank you in English. Then he asked if we had books. He didn't want food, he wanted to learn." That evening, Jenkins wrote a note to the Red Cross, requesting school materials for local children. Within a month, the first American-funded classroom in Kassel opened its doors. 20 pupils, 1 German teacher, 2 boxes of chalk, and a flag of the United States hanging beside a blackboard that still bore faint Nazi slogans, half erased. At the same time, tensions simmered. Not all soldiers agreed. Some refused to share. Others thought compassion was weakness. A few even faced reprimands for fraternizing, but the pattern was clear. Empathy was winning, not by decree, but by repetition. 1 loaf, 1 coat, 1 shared laugh at a broken phrase of German English. Across Germany, soldiers who embraced the code of kindness left small traces, diaries, photographs, and letters. In one found decades later, Jenkins signed off with a sentence that encapsulated the paradox of victory. "I came here to end a war. I'm staying to learn how peace works." And to you watching this, what would you have done in his place? Obey the rule of distance or follow the instinct of mercy? Does kindness after a war betray justice or redeem it? Summer 1947. The Rhine shimmered beneath a pale morning haze, its waters carrying debris from the last winter floods. On the western bank, near the town of Remagen, men in olive uniforms and women in patched gray dresses worked side by side, driving wooden stakes into the mud. They were rebuilding a temporary footbridge where, 2 years earlier, the original Ludendorff Bridge had collapsed under artillery fire and exhaustion. Now, the war was a memory, but the bridge had become something more than an engineering project. It was a symbol of what both sides had learned to repair. The reconstruction was part of a joint local initiative overseen by Captain Frank Dalton, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He had fought in the region during the last days of the war and lost half his platoon crossing the same river. Yet when he returned in 1947, he found himself commanding not soldiers, but volunteers, former Wehrmacht engineers, farmers, and housewives. Among them was Lieselotte Brandt, a 30-year-old widow whose husband had died on the Eastern Front. She wore a white kerchief over her hair to block the sun. Dalton remembered her because she never stopped working, even when her hands bled. When a photographer from the Stars and Stripes newspaper arrived, he captured a single image, Dalton, shovel in hand, standing beside Lieselotte as they passed a plank across the water. Behind them, the ruins of the original bridge rose like black ribs against the sky. The photo's caption read, "We didn't rebuild the bridge, we rebuilt trust." And it ran in newspapers across occupied Europe, and for a moment, the world saw something that statistics could not describe: the rebirth of human decency in the aftermath of ruin. The Marshall Plan was about to begin, injecting $13 billion of American aid into Europe, including $1.4 billion for Germany. Yet the most powerful transformation wasn't financial, it was psychological. In Remagen, villagers invited the American engineers for a Sunday meal of potatoes and thin beer, their first communal celebration since 1939. Children who once ran from tanks now drew stars and stripes on scraps of paper, not as surrender, but as gratitude. Dalton later wrote in his report, "I used to believe war was built by bridges destroyed. Now I think peace is built by the people who rebuild them." He left the army a year later, taking home a small piece of river stone wrapped in cloth, a keepsake from the bridge. Lieselotte kept her white kerchief, stained with dirt and sweat, hanging on a nail in her kitchen. When asked why she never washed it, she said, "Because it smells like work that mattered." By the end of 1947, the U.S. occupation had fed 12 million Germans, reopened sound 800 schools, and trained over 15,000 local teachers. But the true reconstruction was invisible. It was the shift in hearts that turned fear into gratitude and enemies into neighbors. That summer, as the temporary bridge finally connected both banks again, villagers and soldiers stood together watching the sunset reflect off the Rhine. The water below was quiet, carrying no bodies, no wreckage, only the soft ripples of a second chance. History often remembers wars by the dates they begin and end, yet the real history of peace is measured in smaller, quieter acts: a bottle of milk, a bowl of soup, a shared loaf, a hand extended over a broken bridge. What happened in Germany between 1945 and 1947 was not written in treaties or carved into monuments. It was written in gestures, in how a soldier chose to feed rather than punish, how a widow dared to bake bread for her former enemy, how a child guarded a loaf as though it were the future itself. The American soldiers who occupied Germany arrived with orders but left with lessons. They learned that mercy was not weakness, that compassion could be strategy, and that justice could only be complete when it made room for forgiveness. Directive number 1067 may have dictated restraint, but it was the soldiers' hearts that carried it out. Many who came as conquerors left as witnesses to the strange truth that humanity can survive even in the ruins of ideology. The German women, too, taught their own form of courage, the resilience of feeding a city out of ashes, of rebuilding dignity in kitchens made from bombed churches, of turning shame into solidarity. Their stories, scattered across diaries and photographs, remind us that peace is not delivered by armies, it is handcrafted by survivors. Decades later, when survivors of both sides met at reunions or veterans ceremonies, they no longer spoke of victory or defeat. They spoke of the milk, the soup, the bread, the bridge, symbols of a time when kindness walked the same streets where cruelty once ruled. One veteran confessed before his death that every time he poured milk for his grandchildren, he remembered that German cellar, that trembling mother, and the boy who lived because a soldier chose to bring nourishment instead of vengeance. We often imagine history as a line of battles, but perhaps it is more like a bridge, fragile, temporary, constantly rebuilt by those willing to forgive. The story of how American soldiers protected German women from starvation and revenge is not a story of charity. It is a story of recovery, the recovery of decency, of faith, of the belief that even after the darkest chapter, humanity can still find its way back to the light. So when we look at those faded photographs, soldiers and civilians side by side amid the ruins, we are reminded of something essential. Peace is not what follows war. Peace is what people decide to build instead of it.